Mic check. Okay. Hi, welcome to Toothache. I'm here with
Ethan Lemons.
And today our first topic, the first episode, is going to be socialism, or the idea of how socialism could improve our economy and how capitalism is inherently evil. Okay.
Yeah.
So a big question I always have for socialists is, how do you think socialism could work in an already capitalist society?
Well, I think it actually has an advantage, being in an already capitalist society. It sort of helps out. Karl Marx generally believed that capitalism was a transitionary system between European imperialism and what would eventually be socialism. So it sort of sets up it was supposed to sort of set up socialism, but the way it's sort of gone and for how long it's gone has sort of affected how that was going to work. But I think there's two ways. You asked how it would transition capitalism into socialism. Generally, how that would work is there'd be two ways to do it. There would be through violent revolutionary means, which is what I'm not for that, obviously. Then there'd be something more akin to what Bernie Sanders, democratic socialism, which is the establishment of socialism through democratic means. That's generally what I support and sort of go with. I've heard a lot of more conservative types saying that the word democratic is just a way to sneak socialism into the political spectrum, but I disagree. I think it's an important distinction from regular socialism.
And how do you define regular socialism?
So the big issue with socialism is that there's not even a hard definition for it, because it's been so widely interpreted by so many different people. Even in academia, it's still a really big debate. But my personal definition would be something resembling true equality of opportunity. Things like universal access to education and healthcare. So so economic disparities don't really prevent people from doing the best they could. More often than not, you'll hear people who are uninformed compare socialism to communism a lot because of the equality of opportunity point. That's a fundamental misunderstanding of economics, because communism is equality of outcome. So the garbage man and the doctor make the same amount of money. Where in something like socialism, the two people who would become the doctor and the garbage man would both be given the opportunities to succeed and both become doctors, and you go from there, meaning that they would both have the same access to healthcare to be healthy and the same access to education, and then where you go from there is dependent on how hard you work. So it's not really given to you in a way that a lot of people would have you believe.
What message do you have for active anti-socialists?
Well, okay, so that's sort of a tricky question. I think there's definitely a reason to be anti-socialist. I'm not going to say that anyone who isn't a socialist is an idiot or not educated, because there's definitely arguments against socialism and for capitalism and things like that. But I would say generally, with the state of the United States right now, it's a bit easier to see the effects of late-stage capitalism and sort of those problems that could be remedied by something like socialism.
How do you think the government could distribute proper pay to essential workers who are not paid enough?
I don't know. It's kind of a tricky question.
Do you understand the question?
You might want to elaborate more.
What I mean is that, like how you use the example of garbage men, I consider them essential workers. It's a very common thing that Americans take for granted, but they obviously don't get paid as much as doctors. Another example that you used. How do you think socialism could affect the lives of those types of people?
Well, sort of under socialism, I'm not really familiar with how garbage companies are ran, whether they're federal or private. I'm not sure. But so a doctor should make more than a garbage man, is the point. The doctor worked harder to get where they are to make their kind of money. Sorry, what was the question again?
How do you think that socialism could affect essential workers who are obviously not deemed as important as doctors?
Well, so yeah, okay, so that makes sense. So, someone who's a garbage person may not necessarily be an idiot or lazy or whatever conservative label would be put on someone who didn't do as well in life as they could have. Generally, what you'll see is that conservatives have this sort of ideology of pull yourself up from your bootstraps sort of idea that no matter your background or your anything you came from, you can just sort of pull yourself out of it and do whatever you want. This sort of American dream idea. I think that's just a whole lot of shit. In general, I just don't think it's really plausible in the United States now. So someone like the garbage man who probably didn't grow up extremely wealthy, or they probably wouldn't be garbage men. It's like I said, they're not necessarily dumber or less intelligent than the doctor. It's probably that the garbage man was, or it very well could be that they're just lazy and stupid, but that's an important distinction to make, that's not always the case. So under a socialist economy, like I said, the person who would be a garbage man because of various issues that are not really their own would have the same access to education as someone who would become a doctor. That would be sort of how you remedy the issue with because in the United States there's a very large amount of people in the country who just don't really have a place. People who have been sort of maybe didn't graduate high school because they didn't go to college, various sort of things, and people that are just sort of feel like there's no place for them in the economy and in the world because they didn't have the proper access that other people had because of the economic backgrounds.
And another economic thing that makes a lot of sense. How do you think that taxes would affect with a new socialism right now?
Well, the bottom line is, now this is something that people like Bernie Sanders and maybe AOC would like to tiptoe around of, but the bottom line is you're going to have to pay more in taxes. If you want things like socialized healthcare, things like free education, they're going to benefit society. You're going to have to pay more in taxes, and if your whole reason for not wanting wanting any betterment of society is because you don't want to pay more taxes, and I don't really know what to tell you. But yeah, it's not just going to be the wealthy either. It's going to be the upper middle class, maybe even some of the middle class. They're going to be paying higher taxes, and that's just the reality of the situation. It's essentially compromise. You got to give some to get some,
Of course. This is a common socialist ideology. What do you think whenever you think of defund the police?
Of what?
Defund the police.
The problem with defund the police is that it's a thing. It really has nothing to do with socialism, in my opinion. When you say defund the police, what most people, I think, are saying is something else. But that's sort of the issue.
It has everything to do with socialism. Do you realize how much money from the government goes into the police force every year? Yeah,
well, it does relate to sort of the allocation of funds. But as it pertains to defund the police as a slogan to rally people behind, I think it's generally pretty bad, because when someone says defund the police, you have to say, well, that doesn't sound right. And then someone who's saying they're defending defund the police have to sort of break it down for you and explain what they mean. They're like, well, by defund the police, we mean take this money and allocate it into social, programs to help people with mental illness and all that. And I don't really think something as imperative as a police reform should be put under a banner that's so broad and needs to be explained so much,
Yeah, I understand.
I should probably clarify my position on the police thing. I don't think police should be defunded, and I don't think the funding should be increased. I think the police have a pretty substantial amount of funding. I think the funding should go to proper allocation. Should be proper. I think people who are generally are for defunding the police should be for proper allocation of resources. I think you should take the money the police already have and expand upon that, use it, allocate it to training, allocate it to possibly, having, I'm not very informed on this, but having maybe branches of the police that specialize in mental illness and things like that. As it comes right now, it's sort of, if they're crazy and they're yelling at you and they run at you, you're supposed to shoot them. Yeah. It's because the training, I think the training times are just preposterous.
Absolutely.
There's more training to be, there's more training time to be a cosmetologist or something to cut hair than there is to be a man with a gun. So.
And I think that also goes with the idea of defund the police. It only takes about 6 weeks to maybe even a couple months to become a police officer, as a job, obviously with schooling and whatnot. But that idea that what you pointed out with, oh my god, I just completely left my mind. Oh, yes, branches and whatnot, yes. Sorry. With the branches, I think that is actually, I haven't heard that before. That's a very good idea because obviously not everyone who is a police officer knows how to deal with certain situations. So, but how do you think the amount of training would like differentiate between branches?
I'm not really sure. I don't know the ins and outs of police training, but I think specialization is important. I don't think a regular cop who is meant to respond to violent disturbances should be sent to deal with someone who's having a mental episode. You know, someone who's manic and they're freaking out and saying all kinds of crazy things, a cop would probably be more apt to shoot that person if they're acting manic, when in reality what that person actually needs is someone who understands mental illness and is, you know, equipped to handle that.
What do you think is the biggest problem with the Republican Party?
Fuck, that's a question, isn't it? That is a huge question. Okay, so as someone who probably identified more right than I'd like to admit at one point, I would say I have a bit of experience as it pertains to the Republican Party. I think the Republican Party it's very simple. You know, they're generally just for smaller government, less taxes. I don't know. I would say the biggest problem with the Republican Party is a compliance with capitalist ideas that sort of breed inequality across. But you know, there's so many. I guess it's not really a quality exclusive of the Republican Party, but I would say both of the establishment parties are both very corrupt. And that's why you see people like Bernie Sanders, people like Donald Trump even, who are very, they exist outside of the normal establishment, getting a lot of votes, because people are sort of tired of the same old establishment policies that just haven't worked.
What do you mean by establishment?
So a good example is the 2016 election. Someone like Donald Trump, who is not a part of the Republican establishment, he's an outsider. He doesn't exist within the GOP. Comes out of nowhere, runs for president versus Hillary Clinton, who had been in the Democratic establishment for years as a senator and this and that, and is pretty much comes down to she represented a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of just government shit that general voters don't really. When you get to the point in 2016 where American politics were, is sort of we'd seen the negatives of both sides, and at that point I think people were more hungry for just someone who wasn't on the inside as much as someone like Hillary Clinton. It had a lot less to do with policy and more to do with position.
Okay. Would you consider yourself a feminist?
Yes, but you have to make some differentiations there. Feminism in practice or feminism by definition, because feminism by definition is pretty obvious that everyone is a feminist by definition. It's for equality, regardless of gender. But I think some feminism in practice sort of puts an emphasis on women having superior qualities to men. I should rephrase that. Women and men have differences, obviously, and women have differences that are, you know, advantages over men. But I don't think the idea that like women are better than men, or sort of these weird like radical feminists, I guess you could call them, mentality, is just I don't really generally agree with that. But feminism by definition, I think everyone is.
And that's a very good point that you made. But another thing is like I'm not comparing feminism to Nazis, but like the Nazi the swastika, I can't say it, very Caucasian, but was originally an Indian practice of where it meant like all peace and all together, and then radicalists took that and then remade it into something else. And I think that is a big problem we have with the feminism movement, because you have to explain yourself and why you're a feminist, because people immediately assume, oh, you think that you're better than women, when in reality.
Yeah, it's a big issue that sort of plagues all political ideas. There's what a word actually means and what it is in practice, and what it is understood as broadly in society. There's really not a whole lot you can do about it. feminism is sort of puzzling to me. I think women in general there's a lot of contradictions as it pertains to feminism and like Hollywood and stuff like that, because I think women need good role models that aren't over-sexualized and essentially objectifying themselves. Someone like Scarlett Johansson, who goes to a women's rally and says, she's against objectifying and all that's pretty basic stuff that everyone would be against, and then goes and sort of plays the role of just the hot girl, the hot naked girl in any number of movies. I think that's a level of contradiction that sort of hurts the women's rights movement or the equality movement for women. I think that's pretty common too.
So would you associate feminism with socialism?
Well, not really, because socialism's more of a economic term, or feminism would be more of a social thing. But I think generally people who would align with socialism would probably align with feminist ideology more.
How would you describe the riots that have been going on since March?
Yeah. I think it's hard to... There's the objective idea that crimes are bad, right? And either way you slice it, it is a form of terrorism. Terrorism, by definition, being the violent actions to force a political agenda. That is a textbook terrorism. But I've been very vocal about the fact that I think if you can only peacefully protest for so long before social unrest begins to happen. I think what happened with Colin Kaepernick and what's happening right now are very intrinsic of each other, in that when Colin Kaepernick does his thing and kneels peacefully and does what he's supposed to do with his First Amendment rights to call attention to an issue using his platform, and then he's essentially he's blackballed by the NFL and given the cold shoulder by a good portion of the people of the United States and even politicians. And when you've told so many, essentially telling him to shut up, what they've been doing to peaceful protest for a long time. Peaceful protest only gets you so far, really. I don't know.
Because it doesn't make a statement. The news doesn't want to.
Yeah, I think when especially as it pertains to racial issues, it's I think at this point, really, obviously the riots are bad, but I think it might have been something that we sort of brought upon ourselves that we deserved. After, repeatedly silencing people trying to use their platform and protest and do all this, and when you tell those people to shut up and you push them away and you don't listen to them, you get a group of people that are just angry and tired of not being heard and feel like they've done all they can now and that the only solution they have is to riot. And I think what we've sort of done is show them that they're correct because of all the things that have happened since these riots. Since the riots have started, there's been a lot of conversations. It's started a lot of, there's been a lot of stir around racial issues more so.
And when you say that we deserve it, I know that you don't mean with small businesses that haven't.
Yeah, it's sort of, it's kind of a really bad thing to say, but I could defend it, so I'm not.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah.
Another thing is, what is your opinion on the idea that Black people are oppressed by the government in today's society?
So you mean like systemic racism?
Yes.
Generally, what I do to explain this to people who really don't understand it is I give a metaphor that's generally easy to understand. So you have two football teams, and for the first 3 quarters, there's 4 quarters in a football game. For the first 3 quarters, one team is handcuffed. And then in the 4th quarter, you uncuff the team that was handcuffed. It doesn't really matter at that point. The team that wasn't handcuffed is already up 40 points, and the game is sort of already over at that point. So, institutionalized racism was legal up into the 1960s, and a lot of conservative types would have you believe that systemic racism was pretty much terminated, completely, just eviscerated by the Civil Rights Act, but that's just not true. Things like redlining, which was a legal practice, which is, it also has a capitalist sort of agenda to it, but redlining was sort of the process that banks could just take out these areas, basically outline, redline around these areas that were generally impoverished, that had a lot of Black people in them, and would tell bankers to not give loans to these people so they could start businesses, go to school, buy homes, etc. Redlining was legal until the 1960s and wasn't completely out of the banking system until the 1980s. So it's very easy to see how the effects of your grandfather not being, your grandfather, grandmother not being able to buy, not being able to start a business, not being able to buy a home, not being able to go to school, and then having kids that had the same disadvantages that they had as a result of redlining, all the way down to the generation now. It's pretty easy to see how things like that are still having an effect on people today.
Okay, that's a good way to put it. I like that metaphor of the football team. Did you make that up yourself?
I did not. Yeah. The garbage man doctor thing was more mine, but that was less structured.
Yeah. How do you think that the government could help people, not exclusively black people, but people in poverty, besides just giving them money or like repercussions? Not repercussions, what's that word?
Reparations.
Reparations, thank you.
I think reparations are, man, these are all really iffy topics. I think in terms of helping people in poverty, it would help to not be a capitalist. I think if you're a capitalist, and so as it pertains to race, things like affirmative action have been deployed, which, while I do think are helpful to minorities who have been systemically shit on by, this country, I do think it's a band-aid to a much larger problem, because it is, by nature, actually racist. Poor white kids don't, qualify for affirmative action, while poor black kids do. And while I do think black people do require, obviously they've had it much harder in this country. I don't know if we should go about it like that. That's why it's a band-aid, not really a solution. I think if you want to solve the problems, you really just need to start tearing the system down. You have to sort of reform the racist systems that exist in the country, and that sort of goes along with economic reform.
Do you think race overall was just made to separate people, or do you think it had a legitimate reason to do that?
You mean the classifications of race?
Yeah, so like let's say like the whole black-white thing, do you think that?
Well, I think overall they're harmful, right? If it were possible for humans to simply ignore skin color differences, I think that would be the only way you'd truly get rid of any racial injustice, but that's not possible. So I would say that the terms black and white were probably based in some sort of racial prejudice,
Oh, yeah, they were.
But I don't know really what you do about that. Like I said, you can't really just... I think it was Morgan Freeman who said the problem with race relations is the fact that we refer to each other as black and white and not just people. But that's sort of a utopian view on the idea. I don't know, it's very complicated, and I'm not sure there's a clear solution. But in terms of helping black people who are systemically being taken advantage of, I would say you just reform the system the best you can.
And that's a good idea. What is your opinion on the United States' current prison system? I'd like to hear your opinion on that.
Fucking horrible.
It is.
A big issue, and I'd hate to just be the person that relates everything to socialism, but sort of it's more profitable in the short term to just let people go to prison and not reform. I think you should try and reform criminals, and the way our prison system is sort of set up, it doesn't really promote rehabilitation. It more promotes just staying in the cycle, staying in the system. A person goes to jail or goes to prison, they're allowed to find, they have access to drugs and other things through jail, through prison. They stay addicted, they go back out to the streets, they just go right back into jail and prison, and people just kind of stay in that loop for a portion of their lives or their entire lives. It's because I think a big part of that is decriminalization of drugs. The priority has to be rehabilitation, not incarceration. And
the whole idea of drugs is that there is no bad naturally made chemical drug. It's only the way that people use them and like whatnot, because anything can be you can be addicted to anything. There are people with OCD that are addicted to opening a door 3 times for doing something. So it's not necessarily drugs because it's an inanimate object. But how do you think that we could reform criminals, like very dangerous criminals, back into society?
Well, I think you prioritize, first of all, the first step is decriminalization of drugs. For example, you have a person who gets stopped with I guess this wouldn't be an example, but it sort of plays into the broader topic at hand. If someone gets stopped with a gram of weed, goes to prison for 10 years, that person's not really addicted and it's not really harming them physically, but it definitely ruins their life. You decriminalize something like marijuana and then you not legalize. Let me be clear about that. There's a difference between legalization and decriminalization.
You don't agree with the legalization of marijuana?
Marijuana is a different story. It's sort of a poor example in terms of legalization. But
back to what you were saying.
Decriminalization is important because it you stop so a better example would be someone with like opioids, something like that. You stop someone who's has a bunch of opioids in them and they're addicted to it. You decriminalize it, and instead of sending them to prison, you send them to a rehabilitation center, rehab. That's what decriminalization is. If you get caught with a drug, you get sent to rehab, not prison. And I think that's been shown to work pretty well. Instead of encouraging people to stay addicted to drugs, you get them not addicted to the drugs. You get them to be not addicted to the drugs, and then, they sort of move on. Or if they don't, it's really their fault. But you can't blame it on the system at that point. It's down to the individual.
And I totally agree with that decriminalization idea. A lot of Republicans, I had this conversation with a far-right Republican the other day. He said, oh, well, if we decriminalize this drug, why don't we just decriminalize all crimes, like rape and stuff? I said, do you know how many rapists go to prison for 5 to a handful of years? Like you said earlier, you're more likely to go to jail for twice as long for a gram of weed than you are for raping somebody.
Yeah.
And that's sick. And how do you think we should reform rapists and murderers and what have you not?
Well, as far as reform goes for murderers, pedophiles, rapists, stuff like that, I'm not sure if you can. Reform would be more pertaining to drugs, maybe burglary, stuff like that. But I think when you start getting into the more serious stuff like homicides and stuff like that, I'm not really sure if those people are reformable. I don't know. But I would have to do more psychology sort of.
Of course, you're not a psychologist. Well, I'm not either, so we can't necessarily say.
I'm also not an economist. So.
Yeah, I'm an economist. Speaking of
yeah.
economy, do you think that the prison reform and decriminalization of marijuana and drugs and whatnot plays into socialism?
Yeah, because I think, like I said, I think it's sort of a capitalist idea that you keep people in the prison system rather than spending the money to rehabilitate them, because rehabilitation is not cheap. I think if you have federal rehabilitation centers provided from the government, funded by the government through taxes, then I think you prioritize that over prisons. I think you get a societal benefit.
And that's what people don't realize is that the government and these politicians, they don't care.
Yeah.
They don't care about these people.
That's capitalism.
It's capitalism.
Yeah.
Exactly. And like how you said earlier, oh my gosh, like this whole prison stuff. Look, with rehab, it's twice as much expensive, because as someone who's been to rehab, twice as much expensive to actually get someone help rather than throw them in a place where they'll have depression, mental illness, rape. They're not actually sending people to prison to reform them. They're sending them to prison to have them put away for 20 to 30 years and then have them go back out and then right back in to make them more money.
Yeah. I would say that capitalism, if you want to really get into the discrepancies of capitalism and socialism, I would say capitalism is the prioritization of money and socialism is the prioritization of people.
Have you noticed it's always rich people that are capitalists, because the whole idea of capitalism is so that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer.
It's very, if I were a rich person, I'd probably find it very difficult to not be a capitalist, because if you're a rich person in the United States, you have an absurd amount of control. I could probably use this to get into a broader point about how the more money you have in the United States, you can actually buy political power. Which I really don't need to explain why that's incredibly, incredibly wrong. I would say even capitalists in academia would agree that this is a fundamental issue in capitalism, where, you have people with a certain amount of money who keep that certain amount of money with no consequence or anything like that, and they're not contributing anything to society, but they can use their vast amount of resources to pay lobby groups to go into Congress and the Senate and lobby for them to stay in power and continue to pass legislation that gives tax cuts to the rich and various other things, like that. I just think I would find it very, very hard to argue against something like that.
Well, and that goes into the point of obviously capitalists and very, very wealthy rich people aren't going to go for the idea of helping the little guy.
It's a big problem about it, yeah.
So how do we, as the people, citizens, disrupt capitalism in a way?
Well, you have to do it democratically. Well, I guess you don't have to, but generally when violent regimes, violent socialist regimes take over, it's generally tied to some sort of fascism, some sort of a totalitarian leadership. So I don't recommend that. That's why it's important to have the distinction of being a democratic socialist. I think it's important to understand that what we're seeing right now in the United States is the largest group of people ever in history, in recent history, that are identifying as socialist. And I think that's because rich people, those incredibly rich people, are the minority. I think over time, more and more people will sort of break the, I guess I don't know the word for it, but I think more and more people are going to slowly start realizing that they're going to start realizing they actually align more with socialism than they think they would. A big reason why people are so, even people who would probably agree with everything I'm saying would have a hard time identifying as a socialist, because, you know, when capitalism was booming in the 50s and, you know, even in the 70s and stuff like that, there was such a taboo around criticizing capitalism. It was such a, you just didn't do it. And there was with the USSR and Hitler and, all these things are sort of tied into or related to unfairly in a way to socialism. So when that happens, you create a stigma, a social stigma around identifying as a socialist. So unlike Bernie Sanders, who pretty much fucked himself over by identifying as a socialist, could have just ran as a normal Democrat by name and probably would have had a better chance. But, I think slowly, as the older people start to sort of fade out and the younger people start to take, older people sort of have this preconceived notion about socialism through experiences with the USSR and various other socialist regimes that weren't socialist, they were communist or, stuff like that. As slowly as those people start to fade away and more younger people who don't have those predisposed ideas of socialism sort of start to figure out things for themselves and realize that it makes a lot more sense than they would have been led to believe.
Yeah, and how you said earlier how rich people are the minority, which is a very interesting when they're what 1%, maybe even
1%.
Yeah, exactly. But they have more money than
90% of the population of the earth.
And that's crazy. But yet capitalists still say, "Oh well, it's not that bad." It is that bad, because Jeff Bezos right now is eating shit-dipped caviar, and on a $2 million yacht right now, while almost more than a quarter of the population right now is living in extreme poverty.
Yeah.
And by American extreme poverty is obviously different from India extreme poverty or China extreme poverty. Trailer trash people are still living like that, watching King of the Hill on their 2x4 TV.
Yeah.
While these very rich people,
box TVs.
Exactly, that's the word. Get to live these lavish lifestyles. So how do you think? Oh, and that's another thing I wanted to ask you about. People don't realize this, obviously. Jeff Bezos, and I had this conversation with the capitalist the other day, he said, well, Jeff Bezos earned all his money. Doing what? While almost under minimum wage Amazon workers are...
That's a great point.
Doing that out. People say, oh, well, Bill Gates earned his money in a garage. Yes, he did, but he didn't go out and sell every single one of those $1,000 phones.
That's a fantastic way to transition to another part of socialism that's fundamental. Is that workers should own the means of production and that there should be democracy in the workplace. Capitalism would have you believe, the way it was sort of perpetuated to people after post-English imperialism, was that capitalism offers you democracy. Let me explain something about the workplace in the United States. It is a complete lack of democracy in the workplace in the United States. You go to work, they tell you what to do, where to do it, how long to do it, and when to go home, and they can virtually fire you for no reason. You have no control over your life. You will spend most of your adult life working. And this is why so many people are depressed, so many people are killing themselves. It's hard to feel fulfilled in a system like that. So I think workers should own the means of production and should be...
It's too close to your mouth.
Too close to my mouth?
Yeah, I just don't want it to be too loud. But that is actually a great thing by workers. I mean, production, obviously, owners of companies aren't going to be happy with that. Do you think that company owners like Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, whatnot, will still have major income over, even if the idea that socialism is implanted into our society, that Jeff Bezos and what have you not will have still a major income over these workers, if you understand what I'm trying to say?
Well, the idea isn't to, you have to be really careful with this, because when you're trying to convert people to your sort of thinking, you present a capitalist with the idea that you're going to take Jeff Bezos' money away from him and sort of give it to other people. It's basically the idea, but you can't really put it in a way that makes it sound like Jeff Bezos is just going to be out of all of his money, because we're not going to, that's not the idea of socialism.
Yeah.
The idea is just to take more from the people who have more to give more to the people who have less. That's the idea.
And I promise people that because he's the richest man in the world.
He owns more wealth than 90% of the population of the earth.
You could give, if there's enough money, okay, as of now, like 2020, there is 7.9 trillion paper dollars in the US. That's enough money to make every single person on earth a trillionaire.
Yeah.
And that's what people don't understand, is that Jeff Bezos has so much money that if he even gave a quarter of his income to each, like, one of his workers, he'd still be one of the top richest people in the world. So when people say, oh, you're going to take Jeff Bezos' money away from him, you could buy right now almost the entirety of the United States, and he'd still be filthy rich.
The idea that things like free healthcare and free college would require extra money is true to a degree, but the issue with that is that there's already so much money in circulation that is simply being concentrated into 4 or 5 people. When you take some of that money away from those people, you start to free up a lot of money that you can actually start using to benefit society. So the idea that Jeff Bezos should not have to, I'm losing my thought. But yeah, back to the workers owning the means of production point, it's that, you work 90% of your life and you barely see the benefits of what you have helped create.
Exactly.
And these are questions. There's so much more to the workers owning the means of production question. How do you implement it? How are you going to just, the transition in general? And I just don't have the answers to that at this point. But I do think that in general, that's a better way to go for people.
How do you think, because there's people right now rioting against rent, with rent and, what are they called, landowners?
Landlords?
Yes. Do you, okay, oh my gosh, I just lost my train of thought. Do you agree or disagree with the idea that people shouldn't have to pay pay rent?
No, that's sort of I don't think any person who understands economics would agree with that. That sort of goes along with the idea that private ownership of land shouldn't exist, or things like sort of a left libertarian idea, which sort of relates to like anarchism, that private property shouldn't exist and that we shouldn't sell water and stuff like that. Things that would sound good, but in practice just don't work.
It really isn't. And I personally don't think that there should be private owned land, but the realization part of me is that's not.
There's just so many problems that go with that. If you want an economic system to run, there's people would say socialism is utopian, but in true left libertarianism would be very utopian.
Exactly.
This idea that land belongs to everybody and that the resources of the earth should belong to everybody, and it's sort of it's just it's very much too far-fetched utopian to
exactly. And
conceive.
Socialism is much more achievable.
Oh yeah.
Than
it's been done in a lot of places.
Exactly. And when people, I'm sorry, I don't want to get off track, but when people say that America is the greatest country on earth, that's bullshit. We are not the only free country on earth. Japan is free, Spain is free, Argentina is free. The list goes on and on. There are 75 countries right now that are just as free, if not more free, than America. And people say, oh, well, most of these are white, mostly populated countries. That has nothing to do with race.
Yeah.
As the idea of people who, not to toot your horn, think like you, the idea that it's always capitalists that think, oh, well, socialism is a utopian thing. No, it's not. It's really not. And until they learn that living your entire life just working and being depressed and having to go to the same cubicle job every single day is depleting, while you won't have to work another day in your life again, is utopian, is the fact that just proves that capitalism is evil.
Yeah, I think capitalists generally just have this idea that, I don't really know where it comes from. I guess I do know where it comes from. It comes from years of propaganda from the Reagan administration and stuff like that. But
Reagan.
I would say that I think socialism is not utopian, obviously. I think socialism, the idea that you can take money from people who have a lot more than everyone else on the planet and use that to better people, better society, is just weird to me that someone would think that's utopian. The idea that, a bigger point would be education. Like, someone in education, or if you're in high school and you're a kid who just doesn't think you're very poor, you just don't think that you're going to be able to achieve what this country tells you that you should be able to achieve. You don't think the American dream is plausible because it isn't. You have no upward mobility in society. You won't be able to go to college. You won't be able to, you don't have a wealthy family to get you in somewhere. You're you feel very out of place. And generally, sometimes what will happen to those people is they'll just become criminals. They'll just, teen pregnancies, which lead to broken homes, which lead to, a portion of the population that, sort of repeats in a cycle. When you give people access to education, the same as anybody else, you don't get that feeling of disparity based on what your parents make, based on, your economic background.
And that's the thing. People, more than half the population die with still student loan debt.
Yeah.
And that's what people don't realize, is that the idea that we have to pay almost $100,000 just to go to a decent college,
yeah,
but want to get mad at the younger generations for being ignorant and not educated.
Or entitled is a big one.
Or entitled.
Yeah.
It's not being entitled, it's knowing the fact that I probably cannot afford college. I cannot probably afford this proper education that you want to give me. Well, you don't want to give it to me, you want me to have it, but I can't fucking afford it.
It's a super, super old-fashioned idea that people who want, like I said, I probably would have identified as someone on the right not too long ago. And like I said, there's definitely arguments to make that are anti-socialist as it pertains to schooling and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I just think that, obviously, and I want to make it very clear, every economic system has problems. Every economic system has people that are going to game the system. People are going to sit on their asses and do nothing and get money. That's not going to happen more under socialism, I don't think. And even if it did, does it really matter? I mean, for the things that you would be trading that for, I'm not sure that the excuse that a couple people will be living off the government is really a justification for being an anti-socialist or something like that.
We're almost out of time. My last question to you is, how would you educate a far-right capitalist?
I think now, more than ever, it would be easy to do, because you're sort of seeing the effects of capitalism, late-stage capitalism, in the United States now, where we've created so much inequality that people are now starting to riot and kill people and loot and do these horrible things, and sort of as a result of just being silenced, as a result of being, all these things play into the silencing. I mean, being parts of right-wing and capitalist ideology, indirectly or directly. Things like COVID-19, people forcing businesses to reopen, schools not getting funding if they don't attempt to reopen, which is directly putting people's lives in danger, all over the prioritization of capital over the betterment of people. So I think if you're going to do it now, would be the perfect time to do it.
And that's the end of the podcast. Thank you, Ethan Lippmans, for joining me today.
That was cool.
I hope I get to see you again. Today's song of the day is End of the World by David Skeeter. Yeah. Sorry it took a long time to get the really train really running, but after a while, when we both get more passionate, that's when we have the conversation.
Yeah, it was cool. So how much time do we have left?
30 seconds.
Oh shit. Okay, the sort of reason I did this is because how you change revolution or how you start a revolution democratically is you get the word out, you get people on your side, and that's important, and that's what I encourage people to do.
Okay. Is there any last words you want to say before we end it?
That's about it.
Okay.